The year was 1912, and Elk Hollow, Kentucky, was the kind of place where time seemed to pause between breaths. A stretch of dirt road, a handful of farms, a small sawmill that hummed through the trees, and in that stillness lived the Caldwell brothers, Thomas and Jonah. They were nearly identical in face and build, though those who knew them well said Thomas had softer eyes, and Jonah's gaze held something colder. The two worked side by side, spoke little, and shared everything they owned, from their tools to their silence. They built their cabin by hand, deep in the woods where no one could see their light at night. Folks in town said it was strange, how they needed no one else, how they seemed to breathe in rhythm. Then came Evelyn Moore, a young schoolteacher from Lexington, sent to Elk Hollow by the state. She was gentle, educated, her voice clear as morning bells. The day she arrived, both brothers went to meet her wagon. By evening, everyone in town could see it, the way both men watched her, like she had stepped out of a dream they'd both been having. Weeks passed. Evelyn taught the local children and tried to make her rented room feel like home, but she could feel their eyes wherever she went. Thomas brought her firewood every morning. Jonah lingered nearby, wordless, carving small wooden animals he left on her porch without a note. When she thanked him, he only said, "We don't get many new souls here." There was something about the way he said "we" that made her uneasy. Still, Thomas's kindness drew her in, the quiet steadiness of a man who worked until his hands bled and spoke to her like she mattered. By the first frost, she agreed to marry him. The wedding took place in the tiny church by the river. No music, no laughter, only the creak of the wooden pews and the faint sound of wind pressing against the windows. Jonah stood beside his brother as best man, his face unreadable. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Evelyn hesitated for half a second, sensing something behind her, something watching. The moment she looked back, Jonah's eyes met hers. He didn't smile, he only whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "You chose the wrong one." That night, the hills carried sounds no one in town forgot. The sawmill stood silent, but from the cabin came shouting, two voices too alike to tell apart, and then the sound of a woman's cry that faded into the woods. By dawn, the chimney was smoking again, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened. Thomas and Jonah returned to work side by side, faces blank, shirts clean. Evelyn didn't come to town for weeks. When she did, she looked thinner, quieter, like she had learned to speak only when spoken to. From that day on, the Caldwells lived together, and the world around them simply pretended not to notice. Some said love had bound them, others said something darker had. Either way, no one ever saw them apart again. The Caldwell house sat deep among the sycamores, its shape almost lost to shadow. From the outside, it looked ordinary, a weathered cabin with smoke drifting softly from the chimney, but those who ever stepped past its threshold spoke of something off, something wrong, in its very bones. The air inside was too still. The windows were nailed shut, their edges sealed with wood so old it had darkened to near black. Doors locked from both sides, and rooms connected in strange, uneven ways, as if built not by design but by obsession. Evelyn learned quickly that the house obeyed no simple plan. Some nights, she swore the walls shifted, closing in, reshaping her sense of direction, until she no longer knew which room she slept in. Thomas rose before dawn, his heavy boots leaving the floorboards trembling as he went to the mill. When he left, Jonah would return. Their days folded into each other, one brother's absence always mirrored by the other's presence. There was never a moment when she was alone. At first, Evelyn told herself it was protection, that in a place so quiet, the brothers were only looking after her. But protection soon felt like confinement. She began writing letters to her sister in Lexington, each one shorter than the last, until they stopped altogether. It was easier that way. Her words no longer belonged to her. At the church in town, people whispered that she had been kept. That's what they called it, when a woman lost her say in her own home. Sometimes children passing the woods would see her face at the window, pale and framed by curtains drawn too tight. They said her lips moved, forming words no one could hear. Once, an old widow claimed she heard Evelyn whispering a hymn that wasn't from any church she knew. It ended on a note so soft, it sounded like a sigh. When a traveling preacher came through Elk Hollow, he insisted on visiting every household to bring what he called fresh spirit. Thomas met him at the door, blocking the way. His tone was polite, but final. He said his wife was unwell, resting upstairs. From the shadows behind him, Jonah's voice drifted low and calm. "She's adjusting to the arrangement," he said. The preacher left soon after, his smile thin, his hands shaking slightly. That night, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door that was locked from both sides. Somewhere down the hall, the brothers whispered, their voices overlapping like echoes in a well. She wanted to pray, but the words would not come. The house listened instead, its walls creaking softly, as if answering in its own language. And for the first time, Evelyn wondered if she had married a man or stepped into something living. By the spring of 1915, the woods around the Caldwell home had grown wild, swallowing the path that once led to town. The air there carried a heaviness, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Inside that house, Evelyn's body swelled with life. Her hands trembled when she washed dishes, and her face, once bright with youth, had grown pale and distant. No one knew whose child she carried, Thomas's or Jonah's, and perhaps she didn't either. The brothers spoke little, but their eyes carried something fierce and unspoken, a promise neither dared to name. At night she heard them whispering, not in argument, but in unity. The soft murmur of their voices would drift beneath her door, joined by the faint scrape of metal and the slow drip of candle wax. When she asked Thomas what they did so late, he kissed her hand and said, "We're preparing him." She didn't ask who him was. As her belly grew heavy, the air inside the cabin began to change. The smell of iron lingered. Candlelight flickered, even when no flame was lit. She found symbols carved into the beams above her bed, circles, lines, and something that looked like an eye. One evening, she awoke to find both brothers standing over her, their palms cut, blood dripping onto the floorboards. Thomas pressed his hand to her stomach. Jonah placed his atop his brother's, their fingers overlapping, their blood smearing across her skin. Together they whispered words she couldn't understand, something rhythmic, ancient, and wrong. Evelyn closed her eyes and prayed, though she no longer believed anyone was listening. When the pain began, it came fast and violent. There was no midwife, no doctor, only the brothers pacing like men possessed. The storm outside roared as the child came, a boy born silent. Thomas held him first, cradling him as if expecting him to breathe. Jonah took him next, staring at the small, still face before wrapping him in a cloth. Evelyn reached for her son, but they turned away. For hours, she heard them whispering in the next room. When they finally returned, their hands were clean, their expressions calm. "He's gone back," Jonah said softly. Thomas nodded, eyes glassy. He wasn't meant for this world. After that night, Evelyn stopped speaking for days. When she did, her words came out as half prayers, half murmurs. She drew on the walls with pieces of charcoal, 2 men, 1 woman, a cradle engulfed in black flame. When the town doctor finally came, she clung to him, begging to leave. But he left before sunrise, pale and trembling, refusing to say what he'd seen or heard. The next morning, Evelyn found the doctor's handkerchief by the door, stained with something dark. The brothers were already at work outside, sawing wood as if nothing had changed. But inside that house, something had shifted forever. The silence was heavier now, and at night, when the wind crept through the nailed windows, Evelyn swore she could still hear the faint sound of a baby crying somewhere beneath the floor. The winter of 1918 came early to Elk Hollow. settling over the valley like a shroud. The Caldwell house stood quiet against the snow, its windows dark, its chimney spitting thin trails of smoke that drifted and vanished into the grey sky. People said they hadn't seen Evelyn in months. Thomas and Jonah still came to town on rare occasions, silent, pale, eyes shadowed, as if sleep no longer visited them. But no one asked questions anymore. The Caldwell name had grown too heavy to carry in conversation. It was safer to pretend the house didn't exist. Then, one bitter morning, a column of smoke rose above the trees. The Caldwell place was burning. Men from the mill raced through the snow, but when they reached the clearing, the house still stood, roof scorched, walls blackened, yet unbroken. The fire had burned hot and fast, then stopped, as if by command. The brothers were outside, unhurt. Thomas's face was expressionless. Jonah watched the flames die with a look almost tender. They said it was an accident, a spark from the hearth. But the sheriff, Samuel Weller, didn't believe in accidents like that. Inside, he found something the fire hadn't touched. The parlor floor had been pried open, the boards stacked neatly to one side. Beneath them, a narrow staircase led into the earth. The air below was thick, sweet, and wrong. By the light of his lantern, the sheriff saw shelves lined with glass jars, each one filled with cloudy liquid, something pale and shapeless floating inside. Baby clothes, tiny shoes, a woman's comb, and there, beside a cracked mirror, a small book wrapped in linen, Evelyn's diary. At first her words were careful, steady. She wrote about loneliness, about hearing her name whispered when no one was near. Then the handwriting changed. Letters slanted, words crossed out, sentences broken apart. They breathe when I sleep. I hear them beneath the floor. They call for me by name. Some pages were stuck together with dried brown stains. The final line read, "I have joined them. There is no difference now." The sheriff left that night, shaken. He didn't arrest the brothers. He didn't even speak of what he found. But the next morning, his horse was discovered at the edge of the woods, reins dragging in the snow. The man himself was gone. His footprints led toward the Caldwell property, then stopped abruptly, as if he had been lifted out of the world. A week later, the Caldwells began rebuilding the damaged roof, working quietly, calmly, without mention of the fire or the sheriff. When neighbors passed on the road, Thomas would raise his hand in greeting. Jonah would nod. Smoke rose from the chimney again. Life, it seemed, went on. But those who stood too close to that house swore they could hear something faint beneath the floorboards, a soft thumping like a heartbeat, steady and patient, waiting to be remembered. In the spring of 1923, when the thaw finally came and the woods around Elk Hollow began to breathe again, she returned. Evelyn Caldwell, or what was left of her, walked into town wearing a long black dress and a veil that barely hid her face. Her hair, once gold, was streaked white as snow, and her eyes seemed to look through everything, as though searching for something that no longer lived in this world. She carried no bag, no companion, only a locket clutched tightly in her hand. When the general store clerk asked where she'd come from, she simply said, "Home," and smiled in a way that made him step back. Word spread fast. It had been 5 years since anyone had seen her alive, and even longer since the fire. The Caldwells still lived in their rebuilt house, their visits to town fewer and quieter. No one dared to ask questions then, but now that she'd returned alone, they couldn't help themselves. A neighbor's wife, trembling but curious, asked about Thomas and Jonah. Evelyn's answer was soft, her tone almost fond. "He's home," she said. "They both are." And then she walked away, her black hem whispering against the dirt road, leaving behind the scent of smoke and wildflowers. The next morning, 2 farm hands passing the Caldwell property noticed the front door open wide, the curtains drawn back. Inside, the brothers lay side by side in their bed, hands clasped, faces peaceful. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, nothing human to explain how they died. The air in the room was still warm, as if whatever had taken them had only just left. A single candle burned at the bedside table, untouched by the breeze. Evelyn was nowhere to be found. Her tracks led down the hill, into the woods, and then vanished at the riverbank. Some said she drowned herself. Others swore they saw her reflection in the water that night, standing behind their own, watching. A week later, travelers passing through Elk Hollow claimed they saw a woman in black walking the old Caldwell property at dusk. She moved slowly, her head bowed, humming something soft and broken, like a lullaby sung for no one. No one entered the house again. The sheriff sealed it, but no one asked him to. The walls stayed standing, the windows still nailed shut. With time, moss crept up the sides, and wild vines wound through the cracks. But somehow, it never fell. People began to call it the House of Three Souls, one for each who had lived there, one for the one who had never been born. And on quiet evenings, when the fog lay thick over the hollow, some swore they heard a woman's voice drifting through the trees, gentle and hollow, singing to the ground that would never let her go. By the summer of 1956, Elk Hollow was little more than a ghost of a town, its people scattered, its church abandoned, its stories surviving only in whispers told over whiskey and firelight. That was when the university students arrived. A small team from Lexington, young and curious, chasing old folklore for a documentary on rural superstitions. They'd heard of the Caldwell brothers, of the wife who vanished, of the house that refused to die. Most locals refused to speak, but one man, the caretaker of the old sawmill, told them enough to send them searching deeper into the woods. He said the Caldwells had been men of faith, but not the church's kind, and warned them that some stories weren't meant to be proven. They found the house by accident, though one of the students later wrote that it felt more like the house found them. The structure still stood, slanted but stubborn, its timbers gray and slick with moss. Vines had climbed through the cracks, threading themselves around the nailed windows, as if trying to hold it closed. Inside, the air was thick with damp earth and the faint scent of burnt wood. Dust hung in the light like slow-moving ash. They explored quietly, careful not to disturb anything. Every step echoed hollow, as though the floor beneath them were listening. It was in the remains of the parlor that one of them, Henry, the youngest, kicked something metal buried beneath the warped boards. It was a small tin box, rusted shut. When they pried it open, they found a single roll of film, brittle and half-decayed, wrapped in old newspaper marked with the date 1914. None of them spoke for several seconds. The air seemed to shift around them, colder, tighter, as if the house itself knew what they'd uncovered. They took it back to campus, desperate to see what it contained. The projection began with static, then shapes, flickering shadows, a room faintly lit by candles. At first, they thought it was a home movie, but the figures inside moved too slowly, too deliberately. Evelyn stood in the center of the frame, wearing a thin nightgown, her hair loose and wild. On either side of her were two identical men, Thomas and Jonah, circling her in rhythm, their hands moving together in a strange mirrored pattern. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She only stared forward, her face expressionless, as if she'd long forgotten what it meant to feel. The film stuttered, then shifted closer, the image trembling. The brothers pressed their palms together above her head, blood glistening between them. Evelyn's eyes turned slightly toward the camera. For the first time she smiled, softly, knowingly, almost tender. Then the reel ended. The students sat in silence. None of them said what they all felt, that she had seen them, that somehow across 40 years of dust and death, she knew they were watching. 2 days later, Henry and another student failed to show up for class. Their car was found on the old logging road that led toward Elk Hollow. The doors were open. The keys were still in the ignition. No bodies were ever recovered. The remaining team destroyed the footage, burning the negatives to ash. But one frame survived, A still photograph taken before the fire, stored quietly in a university archive. It shows Evelyn in that same nightgown, her head tilted slightly, eyes fixed just beyond the viewer. On the back, written in faded ink, are 3 words: Shared Devotion, 1914. And if you look closely, behind her shoulder, there's something else. A faint blur, 2 hands pressed together in the dark, waiting. The land where the Caldwell house once stood is empty now. The cabin collapsed decades ago, its remains reclaimed by the earth. But the clearing still looks wrong. Too smooth, too still. Grass won't grow there. No birds sing above it. Even the wind seems to bend away, as though the air itself refuses to linger. Locals say the soil is sour, that anything buried there comes back changed. At night, mist curls across the ground like breath, pale and slow, moving as though the earth itself were alive. Paranormal investigators came once years ago. They brought machines and microphones, eager to prove what the town already knew. They stayed 3 nights and left before dawn on the 4th. Their recordings captured something that wasn't wind, wasn't water, low frequencies that pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and patient. When amplified, the sound formed words. Just one, repeated over and over in faint, overlapping voices. Ours. The team refused to speak publicly afterward. One of them, a woman named Claire, kept a private journal. In her final entry she wrote, "The ground is aware. It remembers who fed it." Her notes ended there. Weeks later, she stopped returning calls. Those who dare to visit the site now find remnants scattered through the dirt, a rusted bed frame twisted with age, shards of glass, and beneath the roots of a dead oak, 3 sunken stones. The carvings are nearly gone, worn smooth by time, but when light strikes at an angle, faint letters can still be seen. T. Caldwell, J. Caldwell, E. Caldwell. The dates are wrong, impossible, all the same. Some nights when fog rolls down from the ridge, travelers claim to see a figure walking the edge of the clearing, a woman in black, her face pale as moonlight, her hands brushing over the earth as though soothing a restless child. They say she hums softly, that the sound carries through the trees long after she's gone. No one has ever followed her far enough to know where she goes. The old mill road that once led to the property has nearly vanished, swallowed by moss and silence. But the locals still warn strangers not to wander near after dark. They say the air feels heavier there, the kind that presses against your chest until breathing becomes effort. Some claim that if you kneel down and place your ear to the soil, you can hear something faint beneath it, a slow, steady rhythm, like the echo of a sleeping heart. What bound the Caldwell family was never love. It was devotion twisted into hunger, a need that consumed and remembered. The house may be gone, the brothers long dead, but something in that hollow still stirs. And if you stand there long enough, the ground seems to sigh, whispering through the roots and bones, as if reminding you of a promise made long ago.